Hello, good afternoon. This is Celia Lacayo again, Associate Director of Community Engagement and Professor in the Chicana, Central American Studies and African American Studies Department. Today we are continuing our wonderful book series that has already gained so much attention of the amazing scholars we have at UCLA, and this one today will kick off 2021. We have with us today Professor Dr. Carla Pestana, and she is the department chair in the history department here at UCLA. And her book is entitled The World of Plymouth Plantation with the Harvard University Press. So we're very excited to have you today. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. I hope you're well as well.
Yes, thank you so much. So let's get underway. Tell us, how does the book challenge the dominant national mythology of Plymouth?
The book tells a series of stories about Plymouth that are organized around different ways in which Plymouth is connected to the wider world. And because the way we envision Plymouth is as this very isolated moment in time almost. Most of the stories we know about Plymouth date from just before the ship landed until about a year later. And those images that we have envision it as a very isolated, they're the first settlement in New England. They arrive in the winter, they're all alone, it's very cold. There are months and months before they meet any of the local people. So we picture Plymouth as a very isolated place, and this book tries to show Plymouth as connected to other places and as being made possible by those connections. So in that way, it I think breaks down the kind of popular understanding of it as a kind of isolated, all alone, people all alone on the shores of New England.
Yes, and that's what I gathered as one of the really main contributions of the book, where you very much systematically go through the book very precisely and specifically using examples. As you state, as one of the major points that you state in the introduction of the book, that this book makes connections rather than an isolation sit at the heart of the Plymouth story. Can you elaborate a little bit more why that's important?
Well, I think many of the stories that we know about Plymouth implicitly connect it, but we don't really think about those. So in a way, if you think about Plymouth Plantation, there's a number of different things that you know. There's the Mayflower Compact signed aboard the ship. There's a rock on which they supposedly land. There's a meeting with native peoples. There's a celebration in Thanksgiving for the first good harvest. And then there's an overall image of kind of piety, sacrifice, hard work, that are the sort of images that we have of Plymouth. But the way we think about those doesn't really put them in a context. It just has them as kind of snapshots, vignettes, a moment. And I think all those moments are fine. All those images are fine, except for the rock. The rock is highly problematic, and I actually do challenge the rock. But other than that, there's nothing really wrong with them. It's just that they're very limiting, and they don't really tell you about the larger context, the history in which all of this is happening. And, the reason why they don't tell you is because those stories were selected to make a point for later Americans. Those stories were selected to say, the Mayflower Compact matters, signed in 1620, because, hundreds of years later, the United States would be a democratic nation. And so it's making kind of connections to the future when those stories are selected. So the stories themselves are, in most cases, perfectly legitimate. They just are sort of free-floating. They don't make any larger sense except for how people have used them to explain something about later U.S. history. And because I'm a historian of the 17th century, and I actually care about this world that they live in, I'm more interested in what's going on in the moment and how they're related to and connected with other things that are happening at the same time. To me, that seems more interesting.
And again, therein lies many of the gems in the book. So I wanted you to also then speak about what are the main contributions and takeaways of the book.
Well, I hope it gives a fuller understanding. If you think about Plymouth, and if you think about the Mayflower, what most people know is that there were descendants, and that those people are organized and that they liked being able to trace themselves back to that moment of landing. But other than that, people don't really know that much about the larger history. They know, school children learn about Squanto and about Thanksgiving, but they don't really learn, much else. And some of what we envision is not actually accurate. So, all the images of somber clothing, for instance, are not accurate. Lots of those kinds of basic ideas that we have based on paintings from the 19th century or other graphic images from the 19th century are just, they're not intentionally made incorrect. They're just somebody's idea of what it probably must have looked like. But as historians, we actually know what it looked like, and that there were not actually Plains Indians at the first Thanksgiving, as many paintings depict or whatever. And so, the book gives a fuller understanding of the actual history, which I would say is the main contribution. It looks a lot at everyday life, at things that happen just kind of routinely, people who visit the colony. Where did people get their clothes is one of the chapters. And it starts with a kind of fun story about a man who stole a pair of red stockings and was called before the court, not because his stockings were red and they therefore were not somber and could not be worn in Plymouth, but because everybody knew he didn't have red stockings, and so they wanted to know, where did he get them? So, it uses that interesting story taken from the court records to say, what does this show us about the paucity of clothing, that they didn't have much to wear. Everybody knew every single item that you owned. And if they saw you in something new and they didn't know where it came from, they would have questions. So it gives, I think, a more real sense of what it was like to live in Plymouth itself. It also, connects Plymouth to a larger context, and I think makes its history clearer as a result of understanding it as the third English colony in the Americas after Virginia and Bermuda, and understanding that there's a growing number of connections between these places that make, that shape the history in important ways. So it's giving a more, I think, historically grounded idea of what it was like in Plymouth, but one I also think is interesting in its own way, and written in a way that people who are not historians, I think, will find accessible and readable. The chapters are short. They always start with a nice little tale that's drawn from the original records. So
that's definitely one of the things that I took away as well. Is the accessibility of the book, which is really important for audiences beyond academia. So can you then make the connection for us about what does this book teach us in contemporary times? And of course, the usefulness that it would bring to professors putting it on their syllabus.
I've already talked to a number of colleagues at other schools that are assigning it, so I do actually have some feedback from people, and I'm visiting some classes via Zoom in various states, so that's been really fun. I think one thing that's interesting about when we think about an early 17th century history and then what its contemporary resonance is, I think one thing that's important to note is that there's this idea that historians just overturn the myths of the past, that we're sort of opposed to patriotism, that we don't want, people to have the comforting stories that they learned as children for some reason. But in fact, I think what this book tries to do is it doesn't really attack the myths head on. It just gives additional insight into this period and what this history was like. A lot of the things that we admire Plymouth for, dedication to democracy, are considered admirable today. Commitment to religious freedom is something that Plymouth has been used for in the past. The idea that people came to pursue their own view of what religion should be like. So there's lots of things about Plymouth's use in history that we continue to admire. The fact that those understandings are based on as much on our values as on their values, I think is really interesting, and it doesn't minimize what they were trying to accomplish. But I think a more sophisticated understanding of what was going on in a place like Plymouth Plantation helps us to understand then how we got to where we are today, and how much of what we know about the 17th century in the United States is drawn from 19th century historians, politicians, artists, and what they thought was important about the colonial past. So from my point of view, it's interesting for us to be better informed about the past in its own terms, as well as to understand why we have reshaped the past into the ways that we remember it today. So I think in both those ways, it actually speaks in really interesting respects to the contemporary moment and our understanding of why we would even want to know something about the early colonial period.
Absolutely. So you can get your copy. They are out. So again, this was Professor Carla Pestana, Department Chair of History, and the book is The World of Plymouth Plantation. Again, my name is Celia Lacayo. Please check out our other series at LA Social Science, and I will see you next time. Thank you.